All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first video of my fish channel. Today, we're going to give a brief overview of the channel and precisely what we're going to be discussing throughout this process. So to get started, my name is Daniel. I am a student at Brigham Young University, Idaho. I am specifically studying fisheries, range wildlife management. My emphasis is in fisheries, and my goal is to become an ichthyologist someday. So to begin, I'm going to give a nice overview of exactly what we're going to be discussing in the process of this channel. So the overall topic we're discussing is called ichthyology. Ichthyology is the branch of science that deals specifically with fish. And fish are a very interesting group of animals. If you remember from basic zoology or the topic of taxonomy, there are 5 basic groups of vertebrates, because as it stands to reason, animals, of course, are divided into several different groups. There's 30 phyla. And when it comes to the classification of life, there's a couple of different structures that we like to study. Specifically, we talk about the hierarchy that Linnaeus, or Carolus Linnaeus, in the 1700s developed. His book, Systemae Naturae, the System of Nature, is the systematic classification of plants and animals that he developed in 1758, exactly 100 years before The Origin of Species was published by Darwin. So this is the system that we use today. There's another more technical system called cladistics that helps us to understand the evolutionary relationships between organisms. But specifically, we're talking about in this lecture series is fish. So when it comes to classification, classification is how we rank organisms based on how similar they are to other organisms. All animals are placed inside one of several different realms. Life itself is divided first at the domain level. And if you look at it in a systematic way, we have a broad class right here called domain. A domain simply means the difference between the different types of cells. So organisms, for instance, that belong to eukarya, those organisms include plants, animals, and fungi, all have membrane-bound organelles. So if we imagine to ourselves that this is a cell and this is another cell, organisms like protists or even bacteria, they don't have well, some of them have cell walls, but they don't actually have what we call membrane-bound organelles. It simply means that there are divisions inside the cell that separate the different components. If you look at this cell, for instance, a generalized animal cell, there are specific regions. You have the nucleus, you have the Golgi apparatus, you have, of course, what we call the smooth endoplasmic reticulum and the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and all of these are divided. So when we talk about eukaryotes or eukaryota, what we're really meaning are animals or organisms, in other words, that have these membrane-bound organelles and are very complex organisms. These include the animals, kingdom Animalia, and these also include plants, kingdom Plantae, and fungus, kingdom Fungi. But specifically, fish belong within the kingdom Animalia. And so what we're going to draw is a systematic classification of basically what it looks like to be an animal. Now, animals specifically are divided into 2 broad categories, the vertebrates and the invertebrates. The invertebrate world by far dominates everything else. There are 29 phyla of invertebrate creatures. That's a lot. Insects by themselves are 1.1 million species. They're the phylum Arthropoda. There's only one phylum to which all vertebrates belong. That's fish, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and birds. And that's called Chordata. So we know the domain of all fish is eukaryota. They're complex organisms, they're multicellular, and they have cells with a division between all the different organelles, so membrane-bound organelles inside of their cells. So we can put that down. We say domain for all fish is eukaryota. And because they belong to the domain eukaryota, we can therefore infer that the kingdom, at least in this case, is Animalia. So they belong next to a specific rank or kingdom. I'm actually getting it a little bit backwards here. We want to specifically talk about the phylum first, because the phylum, of course, that talks about more what specifically, which group of animals we're talking about. So we have domain, we have Animalia as our kingdom. So animals, that's where fish belong. And then, of course, within Animalia, we have different phyla. We have 30 altogether, 29 invertebrates, 1 for vertebrates. And the phylum for the vertebrates, so phylum here, is called Chordata. Within each phylum, there are different classes. Fish are very unique among the vertebrates because there are actually 3 different classes of fishes. I don't want to cover this up too much, but you can see here we have the domain, we have the kingdom, Animalia, we have Chordata as our phylum, and so now we have to talk about the 3 different classes. But to make it simple, let's actually look at reptilia very quickly because reptiles are a little bit more simple. So if we looked at reptiles, we'd have the class Reptilia. And class Reptilia is just one simple class. And within each class, you have orders. My favorite order of reptiles would be the lizards and also snakes, so Squamata. And so you have an order. And then you have the family level. And within each family, you have a lower class called the genus. And then, of course, species. And species are hard to define biologically. There are several different species concepts, and we'll get into those. And within each species of different races or potentially different subspecies or subpopulations. So to recap classification, we have the domain, eukaryote in this case for fish and all other vertebrate animals, in fact, all animals, period. We have the kingdom, and the kingdom in this case is Animalia because we're looking at fish specifically. We have the phylum Chordata. Class, in this case, we're using reptiles because they're simpler, but fishes actually have 3 different classes, which we'll get into in a minute. We have the different orders, we have families, genera or singular genus, and then species and subspecies. And fish are very unique among the animals, very unique among the vertebrates. In fact, fish are the most ancient group of vertebrates to appear on planet Earth. Fish date back in the fossil record 530 million years ago. It's a long time ago. They were actually the first vertebrates to evolve and are thus the basal group in the evolution of the vertebrates. All other vertebrate groups stem ultimately from the fishes. Fish included organisms that were very diverse and very strange. Ichthyology was a very interesting creature. And Ichthyology was essentially the very first genus of fish known. It was a very strange animal. It only had an internal skeleton, just a little notochord, but most of it was actually bony plates on the outside. This was a very strange looking creature. And that's what I find very interesting about the early fishes. Most of them, including the placoderms, the ostracoderms, and others, were really just shelled creatures in a sense. They had bony plates. In fact, the placoderms, such as Nucleosteus and Balthriolepis, often are only found as fossils, specifically with their bony plates covering them. And so they were very strange animals. If you move forward about 400 million years ago, we have creatures called sharks and other chondrichthyans or cartilaginous fishes that evolve. What I find very interesting about the evolution of fishes is that the current classes of fishes that we have, which I represent right here, we have the agnathans, which are the jawless fishes. These are the most primitive of fishes. In fact, the 2 groups that exist today that include all of the jawless fishes includes a generally 2 orders. We have Petromyzontiformes, which are the lampreys. And then there's what we call Myxiniformes. And those are the hagfishes. So hagfishes and lampreys, the debate exists as to whether or not they're actually sister groups. I represent them as sister groups because they're very, very similar in many ways, but also very different. The one thing they definitely have in common is they have no true jaws. They have a head, they're gnathostomes, and gnathostomata is the term we use to describe all animals with a head, but no jaws at all. In fact, if we look at a schematic representation of a lamprey mouth, it has these circular teeth, the oral disc, as it's called, and it uses its mouth to attach on to its prey. Usually it attaches onto a salmonid or some other large fish. It uses a sharp piece on its tongue to penetrate into the flesh itself and suck blood and fluids from the prey, and often results in weakening the prey, and the prey will die. So lampreys are very interesting. They have this characteristic eel-like appearance. They taper off just like that, and they look very, very weird in that sense. And that nice oral hood, as you can see. What I find very interesting about lampreys is that they have typically about 7 gill holes for respiration. Lampreys and hagfishes both have a cartilaginous skeleton, no true bone, and they're very, very weird creatures. They're not classified among the cartilaginous fishes primarily because they don't have jaws, and all other fishes have true jaws. So this is a typical outline, at least this is Daniel's outline of what a lamprey would look like. Hagfishes look a little bit different. Instead of having this characteristic oral hood, they have a rasp, which is very, very weird looking, like that. And they have these almost antenna-like structures that make them look very, very weird. That's a very generalized representation of what a hagfish head looks like. Another huge difference between hagfishes and lampreys is that hagfishes and lampreys can have very different habitats. They also have very different feeding mechanisms, and they also have very different lifestyles. One thing that definitely separates the hagfishes and the lampreys is that lampreys typically live either in freshwater or saltwater, but many forms are anadromous. Hagfishes are exclusively marine. They're deep sea fishes, and they often feast on the flesh of other fish, of larger organisms like whales that can fall down to the bottom of the sea. One thing that's really cool about the hagfishes is that they produce copious amounts of slime. And these copious amounts of slime allow them to, of course, clog the gills of predators like sharks trying to eat them. And it also allows them to slither and slide inside of the body cavities of whales and other creatures that they eat. They're mostly scavengers. They actually primarily feast upon the dead carcasses of creatures down in the bottom of the sea. And there's a total of approximately 76 species of hagfish altogether. And they also can tie themselves and contort themselves into knots and easily pull themselves apart from the prey itself. Lampreys are very different. They don't actually tear off pieces of flesh or rasp the flesh off. They just attach themselves onto the prey, making them suck blood and bodily fluids. They are very different in their anatomy in many ways. They have these holes on the side. Hagfishes also have respiratory holes, but lampreys have this characteristic, typically about 7 on either side of the head, which is very, very interesting. They also have an oral disc or oral hood, and their life cycles are also different. Most species of lamprey, which constitute about 46 species altogether worldwide, they actually live in both fresh and salt water. Many species, such as the Atlantic, or we would call the sea lamprey, these species actually travel in between land and in between the water that's in fresh water and also salt water. In other words, they call them anadromous fishes. These are fishes that live in both fresh and saltwater ecosystems. Often what happens is they'll spawn in their freshwater rivers, and they live most of their lives as adults in the sea. That's what I find really interesting about the life cycle of lampreys. Lampreys also have a larval stage called an ammosiote, which buries itself into the sand, and it's a very immature form of the lamprey. Hagfishes produce larger eggs, and they also have individual larvae that basically look just like themselves, much more identical to the adults. So these are really cool creatures, hagfishes and also lampreys. They're very similar, but they're also very different biologically from each other. The next general group of fishes that I really like is what we call the chondrichthyans. Chondrichthyans are cartilaginous fishes. These are fishes that have true jaws. And these true jaws differentiate them, of course, from pretty much all of the jawless fishes, the agnathans. Chondrichthyans include famous groups such as sharks, skates, rays, and also chimeras. They're very, very strange creatures, but very fascinating at the same time. So sharks belong to a broad group. They call them the elasmobranchs. Elasmobranchii is basically what we call a superorder. It includes two branches, Selachii, which are the sharks, and Batoidea, which basically includes all of the skates and rays in this particular group. There are a lot of different orders of sharks. In fact, to my knowledge, there are about 8 different orders of sharks, including lamniformes or macro sharks and others. There's quite a few. There's a lot more species of rays. There's actually about 670 species of ray altogether. And sharks number just about 515 altogether. So there are quite a few species of cartilaginous fishes just here. These two broad groups, of course, include most of the cartilaginous fishes. There is a separate group, the holocephalans. And the holocephali includes the chimeras. So they're very strange animals. They have long noses, and they're often called rat fishes because of how strange they are altogether. They're actually some of the weirdest fish that I've ever studied. But there are cartilaginous fishes that belong in the overall class Chondrichthyes. They get their name, of course, from the term cartilage. They don't have true bone inside their bodies. They do have jaws and teeth that are very similar to what you would call true bone in other fishes. But their main skeleton is just made out of cartilage. And therefore, the fossils of sharks don't really show full skeletons. Mostly it shows teeth, and also on occasion, you'll find jaws. There are very interesting biting mechanisms among, say, sharks and other creatures in this group. And this is my representation of, what a typical shark would look like, even though it's not very accurate. Sharks are some of the coolest fishes on the planet Earth. That's my bias, but I think that's true. They typically have about 5 gill slits on either side of the head, not actual gills like you would see in a bony fish, which we'll get into later. But they have 5 gill slits on the side of the head for respiration. Some sharks, including requiem sharks and the carpet sharks, have actual spiracles, just like we see in rays, in order to siphon out various parts of sand and other things inside the water. They have these things called hylostylic jaws. The jaws themselves are actually not connected to the main head itself. So therefore, they can actually extend their jaws out. And that is something I find really cool about sharks and other cartilaginous fishes. Many species of rays, and as you can see, they have this very wing-like pattern to their bodies. This is a typical stingray. And they're very flattened. I basically picture rays as a dorsal flattened shark. They're very, very similar to sharks, but they're very different in other ways. They spend most of the time on the bottom. Some, like manta rays and the devil rays, will spend most of the time in the open ocean as plankton feeders. But for the most part, rays are bottom feeding creatures. They eat mollusks and shellfish. Some have barbs that have venom and are very painful. It produces a very painful sting when you get stung by any stingray when the barb goes in. Holocephalans are very strange creatures, and not very many species of them, about 100 altogether. And they can live all over the ocean, deep water usually, but they're also found in the mid-water levels. So the chondrichthyans, we'll have a whole episode all about the chondrichthyans and what they are and how they evolved and why they are the way they are today. But they're my favorite group of fishes overall, principally because of how awesome they are and how they've remained largely unchanged for about 400 million years, especially the sharks altogether. The last big class of fishes to talk about is the biggest of all, osteichthyes. We'll erase this as well. So osteichthyes is what we call bony fishes. And this is such a huge group of fishes. Altogether, I forgot to mention this in the beginning, there are about 35,000 species of fish altogether, known to science, approximately. And of these, well over 95% are bony fishes. About, in fact, 33,000 at least are bony fishes. So what characterizes a bony fish? Well, as we mentioned previously, and as I'll mention in other lectures and other videos, fish don't form a natural group. The differences we find between, say, bony fishes, cartilaginous fishes are as great as the differences between a reptile like a snake and even a mammal like a deer. They are very, very interesting creatures. In fact, they don't form a natural group at all, meaning that they're basically an assemblage of very distinctive lineages of organisms. They still have that common ancestor of all fish, but they evolved so differently that, of course, there's very little relation between them. They're only grouped together because of a few biological similarities. Bony fishes are more notorious and difficult to classify because basically the only thing that unifies them is the fact that they have a bony skeleton. And that's really the difference here. There are many primitive groups of bony fishes, chondrosteans in particular, the sturgeons and their relatives, but bony fishes all have a bony skeleton. And that is the thing that really unifies all these guys together. A bony skeleton overall is how we can distinguish between these guys and all the fishes. Because remember, jawless fishes and cartilaginous fishes both have cartilaginous skeletons. There are actually two orders of bony fishes, the Acipenseriformes. Acipenseriformes are the sturgeons, and also the Polypteriformes. Not Polypteriformes, Polydontidae. Acipenseriformes includes these two families. We call them sturgeon and paddlefishes. The first is Acipenseridae, which is the sturgeons, and also the Polydontidae, which includes the paddlefishes. These are called chondrosteans, and they're primitive, very primitive bony fishes. And chondrosteans, of course, actually have a cartilaginous skeleton, but they have bony elements in the skull. That distinguishes them. They also have bony scutes, especially sturgeon, not paddlefish, but sturgeon do have bony scutes along the sides of their body. There are two broad categories of bony fishes within osteichthyes. The first are what we call the sarcopterygians. And the sarcopterygians are lobe-finned fishes. Lobe-finned fishes are called lobe-finned fishes specifically because of the difference in their fin structure from that of other fishes. Whereas the next group of fishes, the actinopterygians, or the ray-finned fishes, these ray-finned fishes have ray elements that come from their fin, and it forms a fin kind of like that. We'll just draw that as a generalized fin. Lobe-finned fishes actually have very different structures. Specifically, they have the same bony pattern that we see in all other vertebrates, including us. One bone followed by two bones, followed by many smaller bones. And this group, of course, includes the coelacanths and the lungfishes, Latimeriformes and Lepidosiroformes. Basically, these are the fishes that evolved into the very first amphibians, that evolved into the very first land creatures that we see, at least the land vertebrates. And so this is the arrangement of the bones of a typical sarcopterygian. A ray fin fish is a very different arrangement. They have a much more uniform assemblage of bones, not the same exact pattern that we see in, say, tetrapods and other creatures like that. But they also have ray elements instead of these very thick, fleshy lobes or very thick, fleshy fins that allow them to walk on the bottom. So these are the two broad categories. The classification of bony fishes is so diverse and so detailed, we'll have to go through it step by step and go through each order of fishes individually. But I hope this was a good overview of the fishes, essentially what the classification looks like, the basics about their evolution, and how fishes have basically become the way that they are. I hope it's useful. I hope the information I provided was largely correct. If it is incorrect in any way, as I review the video, I will make corrections in later videos in the comments. Thank you for watching.